Why don't we go ahead and get started? It's good to see everybody this morning. So welcome to Treasure Hunt. My name is Skooglund. So yes, it's been quite a week, quite a couple months. I hope that that our practice and these teachings have been serving you well in this time. So what we're here to do, though, in particular, is explore the early Buddhist texts. And for over a year now, actually, we have been studying the well-known Satipatthana Sutta from Buddhism's Pali Canon. Now, the text is usually, or the title of the text is usually translated as the foundations of mindfulness. It's also translated as the establishments of mindfulness or the applications of mindfulness. Myself, I sometimes like to think of them as the themes of mindfulness. And one thing that might be helpful to be mindful of, that is to keep in mind, is that in the early tradition, mindfulness is not random. Instead, it's intentional in that we choose a theme, we establish a theme, within a particular. We create a theme for ourselves and become mindful of it, and use it as a lens, as a frame of reference for our experience, how to view experience. In that sense, you could say that it serves as the keel of a ship. Furthermore, we maintain these frames of reference over a period of time, and it's in this way, maintaining a frame of reference over time, that we bring the stabilizing influence of concentration into the mix. As the sutta says, we abide contemplating, one of these themes. And as we've learned, there are four broad themes within the text, four foundations of mindfulness. The first three being the body, the second being feelings of pleasure and pain. The third foundation, the third Satipatthana, is the mind itself. And the fourth Satipatthana is a collection of 5 teachings known as the Dhammas, teachings found elsewhere in the sutta. And just to give you a sense of the ground that we've covered in the last year, can you all see this?
Yeah.
So more than a year ago, we started up here with mindfulness of the body. There are the 6 aspects of mindfulness of the body that we went through. We've covered mindfulness of feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, and neither. There are these aspects of the mind that we spent a couple months on. We're now in the realm of the Dhammas. Right? We did the 5 hindrances. Last month, we did the 5 aggregates. And this morning, we're going to cover what are called the 6 sense spheres. The 6 sense spheres being eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Before we dive into today's teachings, I want to acknowledge, this national event that we're in the middle of, this election. And I want to put this great national event into the context of the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha Dharma, as it's called. So we speak so much of liberty in this country. One of our national hymns, you might call it, calls us the sweet land of liberty. And the Statue of Liberty is one of our great national icons. And I recently passed a big banner in my neighborhood, and it read, "Liberty or death." Interesting, it was actually in Spanish, but the idea is the same. Of course, that's from Patrick Henry's famous quote. He said, "Give me one or give me the other." Now, Patrick Henry's quote speaks to liberty in the external realm, in the realm of politics, governance, and human interaction. And as we know, this great experiment of ours, although it had a great aspiration, it was tainted, it was incomplete right from the start, in terms of who was actually provided the liberty and the freedoms established in the founding documents. As we know, women and Black Americans went on to risk death for the sake of liberty and full participation in this system. This work in the realm of governments and human interaction is crucial, in making the union more perfect, allowing all people, the same chances at the pursuit of happiness. It's one of the great pursuits of humankind. It's ongoing, it's full of strife and grief. And whatever gains we've made, as is now apparent, need constant support and protection. The system of ours is fragile, this external realm of liberty. So something to keep in mind alongside that is that 2,500 years ago, the Buddha, he sat under a tree one night, after having undergone his own search for liberty for 6 years up to that point, and having almost killed himself in the process, undergone the austerities. And it was under this tree on that evening that he vowed to himself, "Let my flesh wither away, let my blood dry up, let my bones crumble and blow away. I will not get up from this spot until I have freed this mind of mine." Right? So you might say that this was the Buddha's version of "give me liberty or give me death." Now, the crucial difference is that the Buddha's pursuit, the Buddha's search, was not in the realm of the outer world, it was in the realm of the human mind. Complete happiness, complete freedom, he would later go on to say, are to be found within this fathom-long body. So what might it mean for us? This comparison, to me, it means that our work in the outer world is vital, but that the other possibility, perhaps the greater possibility, because can we really perfect the outer world? The greater possibility is that each one of us can be free within, no matter what condition the outer world is in. Whether our outer conditions are favorable or painful, whether we meet with success or failure, gain or loss. Either way, the Buddha's Dharma is meant to help guide us, like a keel helps a sailboat stay on course, no matter what combination of winds and waves try to push the boat to the left or the right or backwards. And one of the beautiful things about the Dhamma is that no matter what the world does, it helps us to chart our own way within it. But in terms of the teachings, last month we went over the 5 aggregates, which were said to make up what we call this human personality of ours. The aggregates being the body. Second, the feelings of pleasure and pain. Third, perception, the labels that we place on things. Third, mental formations, which are basically our thoughts, our emotions, our intentions. And then finally, the 5th aggregate is that of consciousness. And what we explored was how the aggregates are a really helpful way of breaking down this massive experience into more discernible facets. Now, what we're going to go over today the six sense bases are really, I think, a complementary framework to that, in that they both help us to parse out our experience. They're really good at helping us to deconstruct our experience, so that we're not having to deal with some big amorphous mass of just whatever feels yucky, a mass of yuck. So with the five aggregates, the Buddha points out how we create trouble for ourselves by concocting a sense of self, right? And claiming things, the aggregates and other things as me or mine. And with the six sense bases, the next teaching that we're doing today, the Buddha points out how we create trouble for ourselves by getting attached, fettered is the term, to the experiences of sight, sound, smell, tastes, touches, and then finally thoughts. In Buddhism, there are six senses. And one spin-off of this is that we also engage in a process that the tradition calls mental proliferation, pancha. And with that, it's said that we have these raw experiences at the six sense gates, and then we go on to create vast mental worlds. We go on to tell complex stories, all kinds of stories to ourselves that we get caught inside. I'm going to share the screen one more time. Everybody see this? So this is the one part of the text that we're going to go over today. And I'll just go ahead and read this out loud, starting here. And it says, and again, this is Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation of the Satipatthana Sutta. And he translates it, and further, the monk remains focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the sixfold internal and external sense media. It's the six senses. And how does a monk remain focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the sixfold internal and external sense media? There is a case where he discerns the I, he discerns forms, and he discerns the fetter that arises dependent on both. He discerns how there is the arising of an unarisen fetter. He discerns how there is the abandoning of a fetter once it has arisen. And he discerns how there is no further appearance in the future of a fetter that has been abandoned. And then this basic formula is repeated for the other sense media, the eye, ear, for the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the intellect. Right? So we have the six senses. We discern how they arise, how they're abandoned, and how they don't appear in the future. So we have a fetter that binds each of the six sense organs, or six receptors, you might say, to their respective sense objects, to what each of the receptors cognize. And with each of the six, there are four ways of approaching them, as the text says. So it's 6 times 4 possibilities, you might say. We see or we discern, we understand the fetter, we know that it's there. Next, we understand how the fetter arises. And then notice this, it's not just how the fetter passes away. It's how the fetter is abandoned, how we let go of it. And then finally, we understand how the fetter is kept at bay. So now fetter is a fairly common way of translating the Pali word samujjhana. And what it points to is something being like a chain or a shackle, something that binds. Now, we're used to hearing about clinging and grasping and attachment and identification, and the fetter is basically the same thing. And the texts seem to apply the term fetter to particular groupings. And in our case, the fetter is the binding attraction between the eye and a form, between the ear and the tongue and a taste, the nose and a smell, the body and a tactile sensation, and then finally it binds the mind to thoughts. In one sutta called the Kotahita Sutta, in a collection called the Samyutta Nikaya, we see there in this sutta the fetter being described as being like a wooden yoke that binds two ox together. One ox being the sense organs and the other ox being the objects that the organs perceive. Now the text says that just as the black ox and the white ox are yoked together by the neck, whatever desire and passion arise in dependence on the sense organs and the sense objects, that is the fetter. The fetter is the desire and passion that lock the two together. In another sutta called the Satipatthana Sutta, also out of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha compares the six senses to six animals, six different kinds of animals. And what he does is he sets out a simile in which the animals have ropes around their necks and they're all tied together by a big knot in the center. And what happens is each of the six animals tries to get to its preferred domain. Right? So the crocodile tries to get to the water, the bird tries to get into the air, the monkey tries to get into the tree. But the idea is that each one is pulling, trying to get to its favorite place. And the point of the analogy is that we get pulled in different directions by the six sense spheres. For example, the text says, the eye gets obsessed with pleasing sights and repelled by unpleasing sights. And it's the same applies to the ear and sound, to the nose and aromas, tongue and taste, body and tactile sensations. And as we know, probably especially know, if we've been at this practice for a while, the mind gets obsessed with pleasing thoughts and repelled by unpleasing thoughts. There's more to this analogy that we'll go into later, but for now, just to ask, is this familiar territory at all? This tug of war, this getting pulled in different directions by the senses. Just think of what happens, when you go grocery shopping or even just walking down the sidewalk. There's this tug of war that can go on. It maybe commonly goes on. So that's one way of viewing our experience of the six sense spheres. There's another way, and that is to note how we get tangled up and triggered by the six kinds of sense contact. We get triggered by what comes up in our external environment, but we also get triggered by what bubbles up within us, within our own mind, the sixth sense. So we experience what the text called papancha, mental proliferation. Now, I think papancha is more than just the restlessness that we may be familiar with. Papancha is more than just the mind's tendency to move and to wander around. Instead, we say things like, something sets us off. We also say that we get our buttons pushed. We have a number of different ways of describing it. But the basic idea is that, there's something that lasts 1 second or a few moments, and we come into some sense contact, and then the mind reverberates, kind of like, a bell being hit by a stick. There's the moment of being, struck by the stick, but then the mind just keeps reverberating on and on and on. Now, you may be familiar with a Jataka tale called The Flight of the Beasts. I think I've shared it once in this class. But it's a story of the past lives of the Buddha when he took the incarnation of various animals. But in this story, there's a rabbit, and the rabbit is resting in his hole in the ground, and a mango drops out of a tree above and makes a loud thud. Now, the rabbit thinks that the earth is caving in, and he starts running through the forest. And then the other animals, ask the rabbit why he's running, and he says that the earth is caving in, and they start running with him. And pretty soon there's a stampede, all kinds of animals running. And in this story, there's a lion who is said to be, in this case, the past incarnation of the Buddha. The animals stampede past the lion, and the lion realizes that the earth isn't caving in, and that these animals are running toward the ocean, and that they will drown shortly. So the lion runs ahead of them, roars 3 times, and stops the stampede. Now, when I taught kids this story, I used to say that life is full of mangoes, and that our minds tend to be full of stampedes. Right? But mindfulness, the lion, can roar its roar and can help us stop these stampedes. Now, for us, for example, we might see in ourselves how we're, for example, on the receiving end of a rude comment. A mango bonks us on the head, you might say. And with that rude comment, we have the initial sense of unpleasant. And alongside that perception, we have the perception that the other person is a jerk. And then maybe we go on and on and on, running, and we defend ourselves in our own minds for days and days. Right? We imagine what we should have said in the actual moment, and we imagine that if we ever see that person again, this is what we're going to say to them in response. So there's also a sutta, there's another sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle discourses. It's MN 18. It's called the honey cake. And what it does is describe the subtler aspects of this. It describes the interplay between perception, between feelings of pleasure and pain, and then papancha. So perceptions, feelings, and papancha. And the way it works is that we get this raw data coming in, just to say, and just to say even a thought, in its initial arising is just raw data. Okay? But the thing is, in the initial microseconds of taking something in, we apply labels of perception. It's not just raw. We apply these little micro-perceptions. And the labels tend to have another layer of the thing being attractive or irritating. Right? That's the feeling aspect. in these initial micro moments. So, for example, we hear a sound and we apply the label bird to the raw sound vibrations. We don't have to verbalize that in our minds, but there's an immediate recognition. We perceive one kind of sound vibrations as bird, and there may be an additional perception of not just bird, but of mourning dove. We know what a mourning dove sounds like. And then we start to have that maybe feeling right alongside that, that's nice. Sound of a mourning dove. And then you might go on to think, I hope that dove hangs around a while. Now, I'd like to hear that for a while. Keep making that nice sound. On the other hand, we could hear sound in our minds, immediately apply the perception, leaf blower. Right? And that has an overlay of being irritating. We tense up. We might think, as a result, dang it was so nice and quiet. Is it they're going to scare the dove away? No, I hope they finish up fast out there. We go even further. Think about how bad these things are for the environment. Why are these things still allowed? Again, a little bit of a stampede. These are trivial examples, but I think it is an example of a crucial moment in our experience. It's a crucial moment in our fashioning of experience. And it's often so quick that it can go unseen. We have these little micro moments of perception in which we're having an initial experience of something, and we have a feeling of it as being attractive or irritating, and then it's off to the races. We're off proliferating. If we don't catch it, with the non-trivial types of contact, our personal relations, discussions of religion and politics, we might typically add layers of habitual views and opinions. We pile those on. We pile on past associations, old thinking patterns. And then, as the sutta says, it says we are beset by an onslaught of proliferation with respect to the past, the present, and the future. Right, so you might end up saying we end up futurizing and we end up pasteurizing. And if we let this get out of hand, the sutta says that we go on even further. It says we resort to weapons, quarrels, brawls, disputes, recriminations, malice, and lies. Sometimes I read these texts and it's amazing how 2,500 years ago sounds a lot like today, right? There are other passages that shine a light on this dynamic as well. In verse 42 of the Dhammapada, it says, your worst enemy can't harm you as much as your own mind when it's ill-directed. The idea here, I think, is that we tend to focus on external adversaries, but we can wake up to how our own mind is doing us harm as well. And in verse 2 of the Dhammapada, it says, he abused me, attacked me, defeated me, robbed me. The people carrying on like this, we might say proliferating like this, it says, ill will does not end. Proliferate like this, ill will does not end. Now, today's version of this may go something like, she attacked me on Twitter, he gossiped about me at the office, right? But this whole realm of social relations, it can be so consuming so burdensome to ourselves. Again, in the Dhammapada, in verse 134, it's talking about being on the receiving end of criticism, and it says, if, like a broken bell, you do not reverberate in the face of criticism, then you have attained nibbana, and there is no aversion found in you. Now, we may not find the idea of being like a broken bell too inspiring, but the idea is that we don't have that reverberating reaction being on the receiving end of something that's unpleasant. But of course, the hard part is that we do reverberate. We tend to. And finally, one of my favorite quotes that I heard early on in my practice is an apt description, I think, of the burden of proliferation. I think it was Guy Armstrong years ago. He said, if someone else was talking to me as much as my own mind talks to me, I'd be begging them to stop. So the point is that it can be a really helpful thing that we can do for ourselves to watch for when we get impacted by mangoes. Watch out for when we want to start running. Watch out for the stampedes. Watch out for when we start to concoct mental worlds. Just so the next time, for example, watch for this. So the next time you see a news headline, the next time you see a particular politician's face or whatever. And so it goes with the rest of the six senses. Watch out for it. Watch what happens. Clue into those micro moments that happen right at the beginning of a sense contact. When I taught kids, I used to say that it's great to be creative. But the thing is, sometimes we can create things within our own minds that give us a hard time. The daydreams that we create can feel nice, but we can also create daymares, right? Nightmares that happen in the middle of the day. We can create bad dreams within our waking moments about things that aren't actually happening, or at least not actually happening anymore. Thinking back to the flight of the beast, one part of our mind can be that lion that roars and stops the stampede. Stops the stampede of unhelpful, of hurtful storytelling and papancha. But this is important. We don't just have to be reactive. Right? It's not just about realizing that we're doing something while we're in the middle of it, or after we've started to do something. We can be proactive. One of the teachings in the early tradition that gets a really bad rap, along with renunciation, that I like to try to do a little better PR for, is this idea that we should guard our senses, that we should restrain our senses. Because of course, typically we don't like the sounds of those words, guard, restrain. It sounds kind of Puritan. But just to know that the original intent, wasn't to be harsh with ourselves or deny ourselves happiness and pleasure. It's more about, it's more along the lines of not letting a little kid run into the street. It's about, not letting the animals run into the ocean and drown. And in practice, it doesn't mean avoiding or cutting off sense experience. The Buddha said that if that was the case, then the blind and deaf people would be partway toward the goal. Instead, it's about being careful, about being wise, about what we pay attention to. Being careful about what we choose to make ourselves aware of and bring into consciousness. It can be a good habit to get ourselves into, to ask, is paying attention to this doing me any good? And then, once we do engage in a sense contact or some train of thought, we're careful, in real time about what we're making of it in the moment. We can be alert to what sort of perceptions we're applying in a situation. Well, this is basically what guarding the senses is about. So back to the Satipatthana Sutta, the one that had the simile of the 6 animals. So the Buddha finishes the simile with the idea that instead of the ropes being tied together in one big knot and the animals are pulling in different directions, he finishes the simile by talking about how the 6 ropes could all be tied to a wooden post. The wooden post being, driven, sunk deep into the ground, and that the animals, they pull and pull, but eventually tire themselves out and lie down. In the simile, the Buddha says that for us, mindfulness of the body can act like a wooden post. Mindfulness of the body can help keep the 6 senses from pulling us in random, maybe not so helpful directions. So with this, the Buddha points us back to the basics, the first foundation of mindfulness. Breathing in, breathing out, keeping the awareness collected within our postures, collected within our movements. While this may not sound like much, how could this be helpful? But when we do that, and you may have had the experience of this, is that by doing that, it helps us to clue right in when the mind wants to wander. We're keeping our awareness within the body. If the mind wants to start to stampede, we can catch it in the moment or very quickly afterwards, before it has a chance to gain momentum. And this way, the body can act like a keel, the keel that I keep referring to. But I think, honestly, if any of the themes of mindfulness that we've been going over, when we keep them in mind, they can similarly act as a keel, keep us on course. It can help us in that we can determine our own course, to determine for ourselves what sort of reality we're experiencing in any given moment, across the many moments of our lives. So again, Dhammapada 42 said, your worst enemy can't harm you as much as your own mind when it's ill-directed. The very next verse, Dhammapada 43, says, no one can help you as much as your own mind when it is well-directed. And I think that this is the miraculous potential of this practice, of these teachings. We can turn our minds from it being our own worst enemy into being our own best friend. So that's what I wanted to share today about the 6 sense spheres. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has been helpful. And now we have a nice, good chunk of time for sharing and questions and comments. And I guess, Christine, can people unmute themselves? Is that how it can work?
I think Betsy just did. So go ahead, Betsy.
So, Carl, thank you. I thought it really fascinating. I wanted to ask you, though, about so the 5 physical senses, and then the 6th one is the mind.
Right.
So, can you talk? Maybe, I don't know. I'm not quite sure what my question is, but I find, number one, that fascinating from a Western perspective,
Right.
that the mind would be viewed as a physical. Well, maybe it's my question of what is sense.
Yeah. But it's funny that for those of you who remember that the 3rd foundation is the mind, that's a very broad category of experience, the 3rd foundation. With this one here, with the mind, there's the 3rd foundation translated as mind is chitta. And in Buddhism, it's like Eskimos and snow. There are lots of different variations on the same thing. When we talk about mind in the terms of the 6 senses, mind is actually a translation of the Pali word mono. It's not chitta, it's mono. And in that sense, it takes on the aspect of just being a bare receptor of thought. So the mind has the capacity to become aware of thoughts or emotions or intentions, that kind of thing.
So it's sort of like, in other words, like a physical analogy would be like a pool of water, like a lake. And when something like a thought or a perception hits it, that creates a perturbation of the water.
Yeah.
So that's how mind is in the 6th sense.
Right.
You're talking about
Their cognition of it.
The only other question, and then I don't want to dominate the conversation, but the other question I have is, I think there are times, though, when we may not be aware. We may be totally physically experiencing something, like tasting something, and I don't see how you could have the perception in that moment when you're just in your physical, intense experience. Do you know what I mean? I'm new to this, so I'm just.
So describe the experience of taste again. What are you saying?
Well, if you were talking about that, they're talking about, and again, this is completely new for me. But if we're talking about, you have a perception, you have a physical experience.
Yeah. You have something that might help here is that each sense gate has its own kind of feeling and its own kind of perception. So there are perceptions that ride with the eye. There are feelings that ride with the eye. Right? And then on down the list.
Okay, that's really helpful.
It gets really. I didn't want to get into it, but you led me there. That's another sort of layer of this amazing matrix that the Buddha, when he sat down and looked, saw clearly. He saw this popcorn effect of all these different kinds of things going on at the same time.
Okay, so that's really helpful, and just an observation. I think that makes that intuitively, not rationally, that intuitively makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Because there even is in a lot of Eastern healing, and there are winds and gates and all kinds of different modalities that Western thinking doesn't even see or acknowledge. So, okay, well, thanks.
Hi, good morning, Carl. Thank you very much for the chat. Quick question, and it's not that quick, but given today's world, it seems like what we were discussing today, or what you were teaching today, runs very counter. I mean, I know as I was listening to you, I for example, having this almost urge to pick up the phone and double check that, what the election results were, or whether do I have an email. And obviously I'm not that young, and I'm surprised at how difficult it seems for some of my young friends and colleagues to concentrate, right? But I find myself highly distracted. So have you given some thought in today's world as to how this teaching can be perhaps put into practice when it's when everything today seems to push us to do the opposite, to flip channels and
right? Okay. Well, in this example that I gave near the end, the Buddha said, keep the attention within the body. So, it is a habit of us to walk around with the phone and constantly look at it and be engaged in that way. So it really is an alternative universe, you might say, just to walk down the sidewalk and breathe in and out. What a weird thing, right?
Yeah, it's almost a shockingly new experience. Yeah.
Hold on a second. I lost my screen. Okay. But I think that's the idea, is that, wake up to our automatic impulses to check the phone. And in those, that's where, guarding the senses comes into play. It's not that we should never check the phone. It's like we can ask ourselves in this moment, do I need to check this now? Is it helpful?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I just acting on compulsion?
Mm-hmm.
And then, not all of our impulses, that we build up over life are all that helpful. And especially, the ways in which people try to get our attention. Everybody's trying to get our attention. Give us a call, shoot us an email, send us a text. So instead of being reactive in that way, we can determine for ourselves. Breath may not be your thing. Paying attention to bodily postures may not be your thing. Go back to that list of the themes of mindfulness. Pick one that inspires you. Just say, I'm going to go on a walk and I'm going to watch when my mind flies away from my body. And it may not work very well in the beginning. You may daydream the whole time, and then you get to your destination and you may be like, wow.
Yeah.
But it's the intention, that can get stronger over time. We can get better and better at it. We can find more freedom in these trivial moments. And then when something big happens, we have sort of a skill set to, apply and kind of keep ourselves feeling not okay, but feeling, maintain a sense of well-being,
mm-hmm.
that we're not getting dragged, by outer circumstances. Our minds aren't getting dragged where outer circumstances might want to drag us.
Right. We're steering the ship rather than being buffeted about.
Yeah. Remember that a couple of analogies elsewhere in the canon are that the mindfulness is the charioteer within the chariot.
Ah, yes.
It's, and then there are other parts. There are the wheels and the horses and the reins and all this. But the mindfulness is the charioteer, acting in this capacity of guiding and steering us along the path, keeping us from veering off onto the side of the road into a ditch, or whatever.
Thank you.
And it's in that way that I think it's important to be helpful to think of mindfulness as being a proactive activity rather than just sitting back and letting things be, not just letting things be. We let things be to the extent that we understand them, but then we make sure to guide them in directions that help us and those around us.
Thanks.